Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. Just got back from the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium after watching Spurs win 3-0 against Doncaster in the Carabao Cup to secure safe passage to round 4, where they have got one of the harder draws of the 4th round away at Newcastle, and I'll come on to that at the end. First of all, apologies if you can hear my dishwasher in the background. It's very late now. I'm just going to power through now. So there you go. It's just how we do it on the fly, doing these videos. So a relatively comfortable night in the end against League One opposition, a team in Doncaster who only just got promoted from League Two, a team in Doncaster who clearly are prioritising the league because they made 9 changes tonight, including bringing Damola Ajayi back into the team. He's obviously on loan from Spurs, was one of those 3 homegrown goal scorers against Elfsborg back in January. Lovely story that night. He has featured quite a lot, but it doesn't look like he's a regular starter in the league. But he did start tonight, and he had a decent early cross, if that's what he meant. I wasn't sure if it was a shot or a cross, but in the end he conjured up a bit of a good chance, which his teammate, the striker, couldn't convert at 0-0 early doors. But apart from that, there wasn't really much to sort of talk about from Ajayi's perspective. But like I say, Doncaster didn't feel like they were prioritising this competition, sitting just outside the playoffs, and obviously Spurs were always going to make a lot of changes. Frank had already suggested he would. They made 7 changes in the end, including João Palhinha starting at centre-back rather than in midfield. I guess he wasn't an actual change. He wasn't one of the changes. It was more a positional switch for him. And he obviously scored the first goal. So I'll come on to that in a second. Thomas Frank's sort of overall assessment was he felt the first half was pretty good, and he labelled the second half disjointed. And I pretty much go along with that. I think the first half, whilst there was an excellent save from Antonin Kinski at one point towards the end of the half, generally Spurs dominated. They scored a couple of goals. They probably should have had more, particularly talking about Mathys who I'll come on to in a second. But they were pretty comfortable. In the second half, it was a bit of a different story. I think Frank put it down to the press, in particular, not being quite right from his team's perspective. But they did go on, obviously, scored in the 94th minute through Brennan Johnson. So overall comfortable, as it should have been, really, at home to League One opposition, particularly with the way Spurs have started under Frank, how solid they look. And at times, I think, towards the end of the first half, they were really starting to really knock it about really nicely. Shame it didn't continue the second half, but I guess by then the game was won. There was less sort of impetus on Spurs to make things happen. But overall, good night. I do feel and Grant McCann, the Doncaster manager, who I've actually interviewed a few times over the years, lovely guy, was pretty fair in his own assessment after the game, saying that he felt like Doncaster didn't really help themselves when it came to the goals they conceded. Made a few mistakes, but apart from that, they were excellent from their perspective. In between the goals they conceded, and I think that's pretty fair. Doncaster actually played quite well and came to sort of attack at times, but they did make errors, which made a difficult task even harder for them. And particularly their goalkeeper, Ian Lawler, who's not their number one normally, and I think he won't want to watch this game again, particularly those 2 goals he conceded early on. So the first one, again, comes from a set piece. I mean, Spurs just so good from set pieces, such a threat. It's these sort of, just in the modern game, and I do think this was a legitimate criticism of Ange, even though in his second season, the set pieces wasn't a terrible record. It just wasn't anywhere near as good as a Frank at Brentford or obviously Arsenal and other clubs. But Thomas Frank has really got them down. I love the variety of set pieces today. Quite a few times Doncaster weren't marking Porro on the edge of the box, so a few times I think it was Xavi Simons firing it out to the edge of the box. Porro had a couple of shots. They didn't actually score, but they were dangerous, and every time they sort of lofted it into the middle, they seemed to cause problems. And that's where their first goal came from. A Simons corner comes in. To be fair, Lawler has an absolute nightmare. He tries to go to try and punch it. He gets like a bit of a fist on it, but it goes back behind him. His centre back there is sort of caught, on the hoof, tries to head it away, but he can only head it to Palhinha, who does really well, to be fair, to hook it back. It is technically a bicycle kick or an overhead kick, but it reminded me a bit of Alan Shearer's for England back against Belgium all those years ago at the Stadium of Light. It wasn't probably the most acrobatic overhead kick, so it felt more like a hook back in. But he still had to do it, and he took it well into that empty net, which means he's already got a couple of goals. And that is, obviously scored at City, already got a couple of goals under his belt for a defensive midfielder. That's not bad going. And when he signed, as sort of underwhelming and injury hit as his loan spell at Bayern Munich, his first season at Bayern Munich had proved to be since moving from Fulham, goals have always been in his locker. I'm half expecting to see this season, a blast from long range from João Palhinha, because that's what he was known for at Fulham. But he has chipped in with goals already, which is really good to see. And I thought I guess he is playing against lower league opposition, particularly at home. Spurs were always going to dominate the ball. It's probably quite a good game to start him. If he was going to play out of position at centre-back, this was a good game for him, but I thought he slotted in very nicely. And he's just proved to be already a really savvy signing on loan. Once again, I've talked about this a lot, how I feel like Spurs have really learned from the mistakes they made in the transfer market last summer by signing more experience. They just didn't do it enough, in my opinion, last season. They definitely needed to go into this season, particularly in the Champions League, and what was needed. But at the same time, they've got the young players they did invest in last season, like Bergvall came off the bench and obviously teed up that last goal for Johnson, like Archie Gray, who started in midfield, and whilst he hasn't kicked on in the same way that Bergvall has, he is clearly a much more experienced player than he was when he signed last year. So they're benefiting from those players sort of having had an extra year of plenty of games. And I thought, I was going to jump through a few different things first, but on Gray, it was first of all nice to see him start in midfield rather than at centre-back. When we saw the team sheet, I did wonder about maybe Palhinha, but most people's thoughts were to Gray starting there because that's what he played a lot last season under Ange. But it was him in midfield, and not just midfield, sort of in a deeper line position. He was very high up. At some points, he was even playing nigh on centre forward when Tell had been sort of dragged out wide. He was a very high up number 8, and I thought he had a good game. I thought he was solid and made some really good runs in behind. I like to see more of that from Gray, because if he can come to the party with the way that Sarr started this season, who by the way missed out with he said it. Frank afterwards said he had a bit of a stretch in the thigh, which was so we left him out as a precaution. But he thinks he should be available for Wolves on Saturday. The way Sarr started, obviously the way Bergvall started, and then the experience of obviously Palhinha, Bentancur, Basuma if he comes back into it, and Xavi Simons. Suddenly they're pretty stacked in midfield if Gray can start to come to the party. I still think he's got a lot to improve on, to reach levels where he can be relied upon regularly in the middle of midfield in the Premier League. But I liked what I saw tonight, I'd say, from Gray. So then the second goal comes very quickly, 3 minutes after that 14-minute opener from João Palhinha. And it comes from Wilson Odobert down the left-hand side. Now, talked about Odobert at the weekend after the Brighton game, where he, as Frank said, yesterday, he called his performance promising, and I think that's a good word to describe Odobert against Brighton. It wasn't a stellar performance, it wasn't something to get really excited about, but there were a few flashes in the second half that hinted at his potential, which I guess fans, even at age 20, are starting to want to see a bit more of, and I can understand why. I think the problem for Odobert and for Tell is the age-old sort of economics term of opportunity cost, what you could have bought instead. There will always be sort of pinned against them if they're not sort of performing well enough. But Odobert tonight, a bit admittedly again against lower league opposition, but he had his fullback on toast at times in the first half. Some really nice skills, step overs to lead to the second goal, where he cuts inside, fired a ball across. The keeper, I don't know what he's doing, tries to go and try and claim it, gets nowhere near it, and the poor centre-back for Jay McGrath, I think it is, for Doncaster. Apologies for the sound in the background if you can pick that up. from the washing machine. Bad timing. But I'm not going to do this any later because it's already pushing half 12 at this point. Yeah, it just hits him and goes in. He couldn't really do anything about it. So that was pretty much, it felt like game over at that point. Admittedly, to be fair, Doncaster did keep playing. They had their opportunities from then, particularly in the second half. They pushed and they tried. And they probably were deserving, and their impressive amount of fans who came down on effectively a school night, a lot of fans, thousands of fans who came up tonight, probably maybe on the balance of play could have done with having a goal scored for their team to celebrate. I don't think they deserved to get anything out of the match or go through, but the way they kept attacking maybe merited that, but obviously they didn't get it. It's another clean sheet for Spurs all round. It was a moment where Kevin Danzo, who started at the back with Palhinha, had extensive treatment after a head down for a Gray shot, which was denied by a really good save. And afterwards, it clearly must have been bleeding on his head because then he had the sort of Terry Butcher bandage around his head, but nothing really for him to worry too much about, I think, tonight, Danzo. Second half, they, like Frank said, was a bit disjointed, but again, the game was kind of won by then, so I don't think there's much to worry about. Let's talk a bit about Mathys Tel. So he starts up front. It was, in fact, I wasn't far off with my particular 11 in parts. My front three, at least, were right, of Johnson, Tel, Odobert, although you're probably thinking, well, that was not much it's not exactly Nostradamus, given that was always quite likely the three of them would start together. But anyway, Tel starts up the top, and I have to say, watching him, I know the jury's out for a lot of people, but you could just tell how much he was trying and badly wanted a goal. At times, he sort of had shooting from every chance he got, but then he misses an early sitter really to tap in, and it's an air shot. Second half wasn't quite an air shot; it was more a complete scuff from a cutback, which was another good chance. And that is just the way it's going for him. I suppose the doubters will suggest that he's just not good enough, which you can't say that at age 20. You've got to give him time, and he's definitely got the right attitude. But it was a shame tonight. It felt like a couple of goals for him tonight really could have gone a long way. And I said to Frank afterwards in the press conference, is this just the classic case of a player a striker who needs one to go in off his backside? And Frank effectively agreed. One thing that Frank said in his assessment of him, he said it felt like a step up from his performance against West Ham, in the sense that the runs he was making to get into those positions was really encouraging. It was obviously let down by his shooting and his end product, but Frank was encouraged by that. I guess, so fans need to sort of take a leaf out of Frank's book. Let's hope, from Tel's perspective, that when next time he gets a chance, he can put one of these away, because I do feel like it could be vital to him to get his career going really at Spurs. But at the same time, if you told me that in a couple of years' time he's going to be lighting up at Lille in Ligue 1 or another European competition and not at Tottenham, I wouldn't be shocked. There's a long way to go before he starts to really sort of justify why Spurs have brought him in. But let's focus on the positive. He was getting those opportunities. He didn't take them, but he was getting those opportunities. What else is there to talk about? I think that's pretty much it. The only other thing that I haven't mentioned really, apart from Brennan scoring at the end, lovely finish. He was quite a peripheral figure, I would say, tonight, Johnson at times. Albeit he did lay the ball on for that first Tel chance, but the way he took his chance right at the end from that lovely Bergvall ball through the middle was really clinical, and it reminded fans he seems to be a bit of a Marmite character for fans, Johnson, I think, because he's not technically the best player, and he sometimes doesn't do a lot if he doesn't score. But I would have thought after last season, particularly with being the goal scorer in the final, there would be a lot more love for him at times. I think there often is when you go to matches, like Johnson, ole ole, Johnson again, ole ole chant always is an ever present at Spurs. But I don't know. I think some fans are sort of still jury's out on him. But that finish right at the end was just kept up his numbers, his ratio this season. Reminded everyone that he's pretty good now at being that clinical finisher running through, and can still be a big asset for Spurs. I suppose his challenge at the moment is in the last few games with Xavi coming in, even though I thought he is definitely going to be better at number 10 than out wide left, it feels like Johnson's got a challenge to get into the starting 11. He hasn't really completely convinced wide left. Kudus has got the wide right area locked down. By the way, Kudus and Romero and players like that who were left out of the squad, it was purely rotational, I'm pretty sure, not nothing to do with injury. So yeah, but scoring a goal like that is only going to help his cause, I suppose. I mentioned Xavi Simons. I thought towards the end of the first half he was starting to really purr. He really started to. There was a lovely little flick around the corner for I think Spence. Actually, it might be Odebear. But I think with every passing game, his confidence is growing, and we're starting to see what he can bring to the party from a creativity perspective. It wasn't stellar. I don't think any of his performances have been yet, but there's been moments and sort of hints of what could be to come from him. I really like his calmness on the ball, and the more his confidence is up, the more he tries little things here and there. He could be the sort of, lock picker for Spurs that everyone hopes he can be, because that feels like the particular skill set that this team has been lacking in terms of a player who's able to do that, particularly since Maddison got injured. That's pretty much it, apart from obviously Luca Williams-Barnett, the 16-year-old making a debut in the last 5 minutes. I think a few fans were hoping he'd get a bit more than that. It wasn't really much to note. There wasn't a lot of time, obviously, for him to have much of an impact. But just overall, what an achievement! 16 years old and making his debut for a club like Tottenham. And it sounds like he's deserved it, really, when you look at his stats in the under-21s this season. He was obviously on the bench a few times last year. I remember being at Galatasaray and having to swat up on him when he was just 15 and he was on the bench there. Obviously didn't get off the bench then, nor did he in any of the times he was on the bench last season. But this season, in the under-21s, he's scored 6 goals, 4 assists in 6 games, including a 39-minute hat-trick against Leicester on Friday. So he's earned his chance. So really, really great for him. I asked Frank afterwards that, does football feel like it's getting younger? Because whilst it's amazing to see a 16-year-old playing for Spurs, it's actually not as uncommon to see a player of that age playing for a big club like Tottenham these days, because you look at Max Dowman at Arsenal, you look at Rio over at Liverpool. Maybe those players are just absolute special talents, and maybe Luca Williams-Barnett comes into that, and this just happens to be a bit of a clutch of these young players at the moment. Or maybe it is that the game is changing. I don't know, but hopefully the first of many, many appearances for Spurs for Luca Williams-Barnett. So let's just wrap it up with looking ahead to Newcastle, I guess. I mean, like I said, it's probably one of the worst draws that Spurs could have got. I'm sure fans are frustrated. They have a pretty poor record up at Newcastle in recent years, particularly under Ange. They've had a few sort of chastening experiences there. Newcastle are in an interesting place. They've been completely burnt by Alexander Isak. They've obviously let him go eventually. They've brought in Voltemada. Visser's gone there, albeit he's been injured so far. He is expected, I think, to be back after the international break, so maybe he'll be involved. But obviously Eddie Howe's done an unbelievable job at Newcastle since he's gone in. I think people sort of forget that they were in a position where they might have got relegated under Steve Bruce. And whilst, yes, he's had money to spend, it's not been... I don't think it's been sort of to the point of being crazy money like Man City days when they first got taken over. Lots of it's been quite savvy purchases and improving players. I mean, Joel Linton tonight scored twice. I mean, I was at his, I don't know if it was his debut, but one of his first games for Newcastle. It was Norwich away in the Premier League. Norwich won 3-0, 3-1, I think it was. Might have been 3-0. Timu Pukki scored a hat-trick and Joel Linton just looked absolutely miles off it. And the way Howe's turned him in from a sort of very underwhelming striker into this absolute powerhouse of a midfielder is just one example of the transformations he's done there. And they'll be very much up for it. They're obviously the holders of the competition. Newcastle season, they're back in the Champions League like Tottenham are, but I still think, knowing the Newcastle fans and what they're like, and being one, sort of being a boyhood Newcastle fan, less so sort of passionate now really, and obviously Spurs have a sort of place in my heart now, covering them on a regular basis. But I know what winning that trophy did for the fans. I imagine most Newcastle fans this season would take winning that competition again and nothing else happens, just because of what it means to win silverware. In the same way that I imagine a lot of Spurs fans would take winning the League Cup and that being it after such a long time without any success. So what I would say is going up to St James's Park, I feel more confident with Frank than Postecoglou, and that's not a slight on Ange. Once again, I feel like I'm caveating this all the time, saying what an amazing job he did winning the Europa League. It's something that will never be forgotten. It's something I've written a book about, which is incidentally out on Monday, by the way. I'll probably put a link in the bio for this one for anyone who hasn't bought it yet, if you're interested. Miracle in Bilbao, the inside story of the Europa League triumph. But I do feel like Newcastle away, Frank's sort of tactical flexibility, set pieces, keeping it tight, clean sheets, it's probably Spurs' best approach to getting a result there. And in a cup, when it can go straight to penalties, they've got a chance, definitely got a chance. But yeah, Newcastle will be bang up for it. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about it ahead of the game itself. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts, guys, were tonight. What did you particularly notice? What did you particularly like? What are you thinking about Mathys in terms of where he's at? Luca Williams-Barnett, is this the first of many appearances for Spurs? Let me know. Cheers, guys.